Easter. I loved this holiday growing up. We'd always have Easter baskets filled with candy, a couple of toys, and that colorful Easter grass. And our parents would also hide hard-boiled eggs that we had colored throughout the house. There was more than one occasion where us kids couldn't find them all. And of course, our parents couldn't remember where they hid them. Only after a few months did we find them. Not because anyone found them because we saw them, no. We eventually found them by following the foul odor of a rotten egg. As fun as Easter was growing up, it's so much more than just candy, eggs, colorful Easter grass, and cute little bunnies. Check this out. Mark chapter 2, verses 15 through 17 says this. Later, Levi invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. There were many people of this kind among Jesus' followers. But when the teachers of religious law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with tax collectors and other sinners, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with such scum?" When Jesus heard this, he told them, "Healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners." Easter. Jesus didn't go to the cross for good people. God didn't send his son to die for perfect people. The Messiah didn't rise from the dead for people who don't have a past, a history, or a current reality. You see, it was the perfect people, the good people, the teachers of the religious law, the Pharisees, who were looking from the outside in at the table of Jesus. It was the people who were hated, people who were despised, people who had terrible reputations. In the words of the good people, it was the scum of the earth who had a seat at the table of Jesus. In other words, it was me. It was you. And this isn't a one-time deal with Jesus either. He was known to spend time with people just like this during his life. And just before he was to be betrayed, he held one more meal where he invited his friends to eat with him. The people who spent the most time with him during his ministry were invited to the table. His disciples, the very people who traveled with him, and the one who would betray him. And Jesus knew this. He knew that Judas would, the very next night, hand him over to be murdered. But that's the very heart of Jesus, to give his life, even for the very ones who we think don't deserve his love and grace. After he was betrayed and taken for trial, he stood before Pilate and next to a man named Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was in prison for a reason. He was involved in an insurrection and had committed murder during the uprising. Pilate, not wanting to make what he knew to be the right decision, asked the crowd whom they wanted released, Jesus or Barabbas. Like any mob, there were bad actors who stirred up the crowd. The chief priests, who called for Barabbas to be released. There was one huge problem with this, though. You see, just before the Lord was going to take the Israelites into the promised land, way back before Jesus came, God wanted to remind the Israelites of the priorities of God. One of the legal requirements for the Israelites to follow was directly related to Barabbas. Check this out. Numbers chapter 35, verse 31 in the Old Testament says, "Do not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who deserves to die. He must surely be put to death." The chief priests hated Jesus because he didn't follow their laws. They wanted to kill him because he was and is the fulfillment of the law. And now they wanted to break a law that the Lord had spoken to them through Moses, a law that they knew the Lord had spoken. But they didn't care. Their hate had overcome their minds and their hearts. Talk about hypocrisy. Jesus knew all these laws as well, but he kept silent. He could have spoken up and defended himself, but he didn't say a word. It was God's purpose. It was Jesus' purpose to go to the cross for the chief priests, the Pharisees, and Barabbas too. And so Jesus willingly went to the cross, hung between two criminals, and died what some call a death without dignity. Execution from crucifixion was the cruelest form and was usually reserved only for the worst criminals. Death from asphyxiation usually took many hours to possibly days. For Jesus to willingly die by crucifixion is not a death without dignity. No, it is the most dignified death of all time. Because he willingly died for you, and for me, and for Barabbas, and for the Pharisees, and the chief priests, for the best of us, and for the worst of us. And then, 3 days later, what we now celebrate as Easter, he rose from the sentence of death, from the grave. Mark chapter 16, verses 6 through 7 says this: "Don't be alarmed," he said to these women. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." You see, Jesus willingly died a horrible criminal's death, beaten beyond recognition before being nailed to a cross, was laid in a tomb, and rose 3 days later. When Jesus invited the tax collectors and the sinners to his dinner table, he knew that he'd be sacrificed and killed. And when he hung on the cross, he knew that he was dying for those same people, for me and for you. It's because of Jesus' death and resurrection that we too now have a seat at his table. This Easter, right now, in the midst of our past, in the midst of our history, and possibly in the midst of our current reality, Jesus calls to each of us to come and take a seat with him. It's my prayer that you'll accept his invitation to have a seat at the table of Jesus.